And I've been particularly excited to hear from George Trautman, who is with Bell Helicopters now, but formerly Marine Corps. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from George. And the conversation is, we want to keep Ideas 2020 rolling. The technology and info domain space is too important to all of us. And so this is the first part of Ideas 2021.
Good. Well, listen, thank you for having me here today. It's a beautiful day in Florida in the United States, and I'm certain it's a beautiful day there in New Zealand as well. I want to thank Jenny, and also thank the New Zealand Defense Industry Association for the opportunity to speak with you today. When I saw in the 2019 Defense Capability Plan that they described NZDIA as industry's main conduit into defense and vice versa, I knew then that this is an important and well-connected audience, and so it really is an honor to be with you this morning. Now, by the way, my wife and I visited New Zealand last year, and we loved it. I mean, the diversity of a small country from top to bottom is absolutely amazing. And we both hope to come back someday when international travel is open again after this pandemic subsides, and I hope it will be soon. So let me first say that I'm very impressed with the planning that has taken place over the past 5 years in the New Zealand defense establishment. You know, the way that the recently released Defense Capability Plan aligns itself with your strategic defense policy statement that was written in 2018 and the defense white paper that was written as far back as 2016 is really remarkable. So the objective of my brief today is first to applaud New Zealand's commitment to defense planning, but also to point out how important it is that you sustain the decisions that you have made by applying adequate levels of funding year over year, particularly when the future is so hard to predict. You know, a key factor in succeeding at the challenges you're going to face in the coming years is to begin with a vision and then adhere to a key set of tenets that will help you get through unforeseen circumstances, such as the COVID-19 pandemic we are experiencing right now. Now, because of my background, I'll try to do this through the lens of the U.S. Marine Corps Aviation Plan and the experiences that Marines have had with the Venom and Viper aircraft that I flew throughout my military career. There are a surprising number of similarities between the U.S. Marine Corps and New Zealand when it comes to our respective defense needs. We both have a maritime focus. We both have a Pacific orientation. We both rely on the cooperation of our naval partners. We're small size compared to anticipated partners that we might meet in the battle space. In our case, the U.S. Army. In your case, maybe forces from the Australian military or the U.S. military. We're both resource limited and have to make decisions in the context of the fact that we don't have unlimited resources. We both have a strong interest in digital connectivity in the information domain, and we also have some similar equipment. Here's just a few of the similar programs that drive our respective nations' defense planning efforts. Because I'm a Marine aviator with 37 years active duty experience and 10 years supporting the aviation defense industry here in the United States, I want to spend some time looking at how the Marine Corps has approached aviation planning in general, and then we'll look at the Venom and Viper experience as a specific example. My hope is that these examples will inform your efforts over the next decade in the New Zealand planning process, so that you can take advantage of the excellent head start your defense planning documents have already given to you. Like New Zealand has experienced over the past few years, the U.S. Marine Corps is keenly aware of the need for focused planning and the development of objectives that are aligned with our national military strategy. Our aviation plan is updated every year, but surprisingly, its roots go all the way back to the mid-1980s. The key takeaway from the next few slides I'm going to show you are that planning is essential, but just as important is the need for a vision and a set of tenets that will drive decision-making over the course of the next many decades. It is essential that these plans be updated periodically, But even more important is the need to sustain progress toward a desired end state. In countries like the United States and New Zealand, which have representative governments whose priorities may change every few years, sustaining a defense plan over the decades it takes to procure new systems is a challenge. And at the end of the day, it always comes down to one thing: the allocation of scarce resources. To overcome the challenge of changing priorities over time, this chart depicts what marine aviation calls our neck-down strategy. Way back in the mid-1980s, we decided we would establish key aviation tenets to guide our procurement plans, and I'm going to cover those on the next slide. But on this chart, take note that we are necking down to just a few manned type model series aircraft from a high of more than 15 different aircraft in 1985. This is going to help us in many ways, and the decision was driven by leaders who were serving over 3 decades ago. Here's the list I wanted to show you. These are the key tenets we have used to guide Marine Corps aviation for decades. As you can see, there's nothing particularly insightful or controversial in this list, but having a set of beliefs that drive both the equipment the government decides to procure and the equipment that industry decides to produce can be incredibly powerful. Now, not to be too parochial, but I often look at other military services or even my ground and logistics colleagues within the Marine Corps and wonder if their procurement plans are based on the old cliche: you can't be lost if you don't know where you're going. So I'm going to come back to these tenets later and look at each one through the lens of the Venom and Viper aircraft. But first, here's the list of the 5.5 manned aircraft and the various unmanned aircraft we expect to be operating a decade from now in the post-2030 timeframe. Each of the manned aircraft listed here, other than the KC-130, are capable of shipboard operations and vertical takeoffs and landings. And all of them, including the KC-130, perform exceptionally well in all expeditionary environments. Further, each of these aircraft has been procured with the key tenets mentioned on the previous slide in mind. It's beyond the scope of today's presentation, but just a quick note about the unmanned aerial system shown at the bottom of the slide. No, we were not prescient enough in the 1980s to foresee the future value of unmanned systems. But this is an example of how your long-term plan will need to be adapted as new technologies emerge and mature over time. The ability of unmanned systems to loiter for long periods at long ranges while sharing information throughout the battle space is priceless. As we move forward, concepts like manned-unmanned teaming, loyal wingmen, and optionally manned aircraft are going to make unmanned systems even more valuable than they are today. These all had to be factored into our plan. And remember, that plan had its roots in the 1980s. Not an easy task, but it must be done. Now, when I first put this slide up, some of you may have heard me say 5.5 manned aircraft, when the slide clearly shows that there are 6. If you caught that, congratulations, you must be listening. And I know from many personal hours spent in video teleconferences since March, that's a hard thing to do sometimes. But the fact is, I actually meant to say 5.5, and here's why. These are the 2 aircraft I am personally most familiar with from my time in the Marine Corps. And I want to use them to show how a vision can be turned into reality through the implementation of a disciplined defense plan. The only difference between these 2 aircraft are the shape of the airframe, the peculiar weapon systems they carry, and some of the sensors. They are all new, state-of-the-art modern aircraft procured at a fraction of the cost of any similar alternative. And how we came to this decision might be of interest to you. In the late 1990s, the Marine Corps was procuring an expensive tilt-rotor aircraft that you might be familiar with, the MB-22 Osprey. And our older air Hueys and Cobras were aging out, much like your Sea Sprite is today. We simply couldn't afford a small advanced tilt-rotor patterned after the B-22 to fill our utility and attack mission sets. But we needed new aircraft that aligned with our vision and our tenets. Blackhawks offered a utility option and Apaches offered an attack option. But buying two different type model series aircraft was not affordable. And frankly, neither aircraft fits everything that we need to do. So our solution was to build the UH-1 Venom utility helicopter and the AH-1Z attack helicopter using 85% identical parts. Both of these aircraft are specifically designed and produced for expeditionary military operations. And together, they provide us with the attack and utility helicopter support that fits perfectly into the 21st century architecture for the future battle space, which is going to be joint, combined, expeditionary, and fully networked. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the capabilities of these two aircraft because that's not the point of my remarks today. But at this juncture, I would like to provide some specific information about them so you have that in context. First, the AH-1Z Viper heavy attack helicopter. You can see its characteristics on this slide. And here is the AH-1Y Venom utility helicopter. The Venom's designed as a utility platform can perform any function on the battlefield, from utility lift, resupply, close air support, prosecuting targets, maritime search and rescue, and many other missions. Some nations are even considering procuring the Venom for use in some maritime roles, such as ASGW and ASW. The Venom's payload reflects this aircraft's versatility. Let me return to the key tenets I spoke about previously, just as a reminder before I go through each of these in order. My intention is to look at these tenets through the lens of the Viper and Venom helicopter and let you know why we chose to procure these two aircraft in particular. Sometimes the simplest answer has the biggest impact. And in our case, commonality was the innovative big idea that made Venom and Viper the right aircraft for the Marine Corps. It's hard to grasp the savings in resources that accrue from 85% commonality between these two aircraft. And it's not just money. It's time to train both pilots and maintainers. It's the ability to maintain two aircraft using the same tools, the same support equipment, and the same publications. This is particularly important for a force that operates in austere expeditionary environments and from ships, as the U.S. Marine Corps does. And the savings are not just in initial procurement costs, which are the lowest of any state-of-the-art similarly equipped helicopters, but throughout the entire life cycle as well. And none of this would have been possible without the basic idea of commonality driving our procurement decision. Obviously, if you're going to procure new equipment, it goes without saying that you want to have improved range, speed, and payload capabilities. This is a snapshot of what the Viper brought us. 2 times the range, or 2 times the payload, a 3rd generation infrared sensor fully integrated with a helmet-mounted display, and perhaps most importantly for this audience, entree into the 21st century information domain. And this is what the Venom brought us. 2 times the range and 2 times the payload, a 3rd generation infrared sensor, and because of the common systems with Viper, full participation in the 21st century information domain. Next tenet we looked at is increased survivability and lethality. Even with exceptional weapons and long-range standoff, helicopters are vulnerable to threat weapons in the battle space. In order to survive, the aircraft needs state-of-the-art threat detection and countermeasures, as well as a purpose-built military design. Ballistic hardening, redundant critical systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, and other measures are needed to protect the aircraft. And these systems need to remain up to date as the threat evolves through continuous pertinent upgrades. Both the AH-1Y and the AH-1Z are fully expeditionary platforms optimized for extended amphibious operations aboard naval shipping. Designing them to be rugged resulted in exceptional reliability and maintainability at low total ownership costs and lower life cycle costs, all attributes that are important for obvious reasons. As an island nation that plans to operate along the coast and from ships in the Southern Pacific, the concept of marinization is as important to you as it is to the Marine Corps. So I wanted to emphasize this issue for this audience. The slide depicts some of the traits a fully marinized platform needs to have, and that's yet another reason we opted for Venom and Viper. Any user planning to operate aircraft at sea, I think, needs to pay close attention to marinization, because there is a lot of misinformation out there on this particular topic. I went through all of that pretty fast, but that's because I want to spend most of my time talking about this final tenet, since it's one that I think New Zealand has embraced fully. I was encouraged to learn about the two recent NZDIA conferences focused on the information domain, which has become such a critical dimension in warfighting, both in the air, on the land, and in the sea. I was also fascinated to see that you Kiwis have cleverly grouped space and cyber into the information domain as effectively the fourth domain. That's given me some things to think about, as one of my good friends just took command of the Marine Corps Space Force, a subordinate component of the newly formed U.S. Space Service. Seeing through the lens of Viper and Venom, this slide depicts what network operations mean to this small part of marine aviation. But of course, it's much more than that. Future competition, whether warfighting or disaster response or surveillance or some other important military operation, is going to be shaped by information. And 21st century platforms are going to need to be able to obtain this information using sensors, manage it using onboard digital architecture, and share it using various waveforms such as Link 16, MATL, TNT, and others. Whether we're talking about targeting data, a common operating picture, or command and control information sharing via text, messages, or voice, these characteristics have become as important as fuel and bullets within the battle space. And this information will need to be properly parsed and shared across a network force that is digitized, connected, and fully coordinated. If you were fortunate enough to participate in the NZDIA forums on this topic earlier this year, I'm certain you came away with at least three main points. Point one, it's clear that cyberspace and information sharing are the cutting-edge fighting characteristics that will dominate the near future. Two, this is a way for individual resource-limited forces to leverage the power of the entire joint or combined force in ways never before imagined. And three, this is really, really hard work. I lifted this slide out of the 2020 Marine Aviation Plan. It shows the complexity of just the internal effort required within the Marine Air Ground Task Force to ensure no gaps, seams, or redundancies are within their own force. A whole new chart, much larger in scope, would be needed to depict the complexity of full force integration. So my point is this: if you are serious about succeeding within the information space, it will take a full-on combined effort of government, military, academia, and industry, all working in close consultation with partners and allies in order to succeed. Now, I've read a lot about what has been written on this topic here in New Zealand, and I have to tell you, I think you're off to a very, very good start. Let me jump back down from the academic discussion of network-centric warfare to talk about just two of many, many examples of how our H-1 aircraft are exploiting these new opportunities. I titled this slide, Integration with the Fifth Generation Force. That's shorthand for a fully networked force that exploits the advantages of the integrated and shared battle space to deliver lethal and non-lethal effects. The term comes from the F-35 community, but I think it's a relevant way to think about this subject. In this picture, I'm showing a U.S. Marine Corps AH-1Y Viper helicopter firing an air intercept AIM-9 or Sidewinder missile during a live fire training event near Okinawa, Japan in September of this year. The AH-1Y is the only attack helicopter in the world that can fire an effective air-to-air missile. which is quite an accomplishment in itself. As you know, fixed-wing aircraft can be a major threat to helicopters, but we have found that the Viper helicopters armed with a legitimate air-to-air missile, such as the AIM-9, can more than hold their own in low-level aerial combat with fixed-wing aircraft. Having this capability allows our Vipers to provide close air support even when their superiority cannot be assured. But even more exciting about this topic is a future capability being explored that will potentially enable an AH-1Z armed with an air-to-air missile to launch its weapon and then receive final course guidance from a Joint Strike Fighter high overhead. This level of information connectivity, if achieved, is going to change the way we operate within the joint force. And it's an example of the kind of things that can be accomplished that we never dreamed of in the past. Here's a second example. The Hellfire missile depicted here is being fired from an AH-1Z along the coast of California. The Hellfire missile was first fielded in the 1980s. It was designed as a heavy tank killer to destroy tanks on the battlefield at ranges up to 5 miles. And the AH-1Z can carry up to 16 Hellfire missiles at once. Hellfire has been a very effective missile, but the Joint Air-Ground Missile, JAGM, will soon be fielded as its replacement. And that's going to give the aircraft a true fire and forget capability by combining both target designation systems into a single missile. Imagine a future scenario where a helicopter could launch a missile like this, or a missile with even longer range, by leveraging information shared by other nodes within the battle space. Satellites, unmanned aerial systems, F-35 strike fighters, KC-130 aerial refuelers, P-8 maritime aircraft, even ships at sea, all operating seamlessly within the battle space, will enable future helicopters like Venom or Viper to have exponential effects never before envisioned. Over the next decade, I predict the focus of most modern militaries will be on the development of a truly networked combat force that will make the information domain and digital networking a critical enabler. So in summary, I'm very excited about the way New Zealand is tackling the difficult challenges ahead. The planning effort to date has been superb, and the way the way New Zealand industry is responding is something that this organization should be particularly proud of. Clearly, the US, Australia, New Zealand in particular, share many vital interests in this part of the world, and the better connected we are, and the better understanding we have of each other's priorities, the more successfully we will be able to operate together. Now, I'll be happy to take your questions in the short time remaining. Thank you.
I'm going to have to run fast or sit closer to the stage. So thank you, George. So I'm going to see if I've got any questions here in the room in Auckland, because that's the most technologically first Auckland. So any questions in the room? And the answer to that is yes. Who wants to be first? So Huntley Wright's just arrived, and he would have been delighted to hear, Huntley would have been delighted to hear you talk about how impressed you were with the alignment of the capability plan and all of the strategy and vision. As part of the leader of that project, I think Huntley would have been delighted to hear that. So a question for you then, what do you think we should be doing next?
Well, I think what struck me was two things. One is I really am very impressed with the way that you've nested your initial thinking with your strategy, with your defense plan, and the specifics of the plan. In many ways, Marine Corps Aviation has a similar advantage that New Zealand has in that we have a small enough resource basket that we're able to write a granular plan as you have done. It's much more difficult, for example, for the U.S. Army to write a plan like that because it's so big and sort of cumbersome in the things that it has to get its arms around. So you've done a superb job of getting started, but you really only have just gotten started, right? And there are challenges ahead. I mean, even the pandemic this year has dislocated funding and dislocated the ability to travel, other things. And we don't know what the future holds. One of the things I said was that in representative democracies like New Zealand and the US, we often encounter political headwinds based upon fiscal priorities that can disrupt our plan. So the challenge, I think, for New Zealand is twofold. One is to stay the course, and two, try to set a foundation of beliefs that may or may not be in there, but I didn't really pick up on them. And that's why I took the trouble of going through the tenets that have driven our plan. If you have a set of tenets that you can go to your political leadership with and say, look, in 2018, 2019, we all agreed to this. It's the right thing to do militarily for New Zealand in the context of New Zealand's role in the global sphere. You have a better chance, I think, of getting your plan resourced. It's not easy, but you are off to a very good start.